Hey folks, welcome back to the channel. So I've got a really interesting find for me today here on this channel, and it's a 1981 Gibson Les Paul. It's not a Les Paul, it's called the Paul, and it's part of their Firebrand series, although it's late in the run, so it doesn't actually have the Firebranded logo on the headstock. I'll show you a little bit about what I mean with some still pictures, but basically the Firebrand series originally started with a couple of models that had Gibson branded into the headstock with an actual fire. It's kind of a burned in look on a natural finish. Now this is a later model when they started using finishes on the guitars, and you can see this one is a gold burst, and that means that they did not use the natural headstock, so they actually put a gold Gibson logo on the front. What I want to do with this one is just sort of take it apart, see what's going on with it, check and make sure that everything in here is original, and then kind of put it all back together. I have already loosened the strings, and what I'm going to do now is remove this bridge so I can get a look at these pickups. Alright, so what I've done now is I put a capo at the first fret just to keep the strings in place, and I'm going to go ahead and back the screws out on the tailpiece, put everything to the side. I'll put the bridge to the side too, just because it'll fall off otherwise. But all I need to do is get these strings out of the way so that I can see the pickups. All right, well, what I'm expecting here is, since this is an 81, I would expect to see the Tim Shaw PAF pickups in here. If it were an 80 or prior, I would have expected to see T-tops, but there's definitely no T on the top of these bobbins. I think these are going to be Tim Shaws. We've got a couple of screws that aren't playing nice. They don't want to let go of the wood, but they're not backing out. So I need to coax this up, and I'm going to do that by putting a little pry bar on there and exerting just a tiny amount of upward pressure while I back this screw out. Then I'll end up having to re-drill that hole later, fill it with a toothpick, and tighten this fit. Okay, moment of truth on this one. Okay, nice. There's definitely a ink stamp on there that's consistent with the Tim Shaw, the right patent number obviously on the base plate, and I can see the 81 date code even if the beginning of the date code is smudged. By the way, the Tim Shaw date codes that I'm used to seeing are 3 numbers, then 3 more numbers, and the last 2 digits being the year. Well, this looks like a Shaw as well, but the date code is much different than I'm used to seeing. This says July 30th, 1980. It's not inconsistent with the year of the guitar, but I have to say it's strange. It looks like a date code that you would see on a T-top and not a date code that you would see on a Shaw. So I guess what I'm going to have to do is get some readings on the resistance of the pickups just so we can verify. Okay, I'm going to need to flip this guitar over, so I'm going to put the screws back in the humbucker rings, and then I'll put the bridge back. Alright, let's flip this over and take the back off and see what's going on with those pots, see if anything looks like it's been changed, and get the resistance readings on those pickups. Well, everything's looking pretty good in here. I think maybe if anything these pots are a little bit loose and I can tighten those up from the front. There's a lot of corrosion on this switch, and I think it's just the chrome breaking down. It's nice and pasty in there, so I could probably clean that up some with a toothbrush. I think these pots, they all look right to me. This one's dated 81. The date code on this one is hard to read. That one's definitely 81. This one's dated 1980. So you can see with the pots the way they are, if some of them are dated 80 and some of them are dated 81, that jives with the pickups. But I will say the solder connections that are on here for the pickups are a little bit globby. Maybe it's because the bridge ground was soldered on first, then the pickup was soldered on top of that it looks like that. I mean, the capacitors look perfect and they have not been moved. I don't see any evidence of the pickups being resoldered at the terminal on the pot itself. It just looks like a little bit of a sloppy job there. Not awful, it's just, I think they could have flowed it a little better. But anyway, nothing really looks unoriginal there, so I actually think that that might be the original pickups. Okay, so let's get some readings off of this. Just clip into a ground, Then I will clip into the volume pot where the pickups connect. All right, well that pickup is 7.34 kilo ohms. Let's see what this one comes out as. 7.34, maybe 6. So they both measure out the same. Yeah, I'm thinking this was a original set of Tim Shaw's, but I'll verify those ohm measurements before I sign off on that completely. Well, what else can we learn from this guitar? Well, normally these things were walnut, but as I'm looking in here, this one actually looks like it's mahogany. So I'm wondering, maybe the mahogany looks similar enough to walnut that I can't tell the difference, which is possible, or these painted varieties were actually made of mahogany instead of walnut, like the ones that were natural finished. And what else do we have here on the headstock? So the headstock is a typical Gibson headstock. It's a little bit wider version of the headstock than you see on some of the more modern instruments, and that's just because it's a sort of 70s era. Even though this is an 81, but it's still the 70s era headstock, and it's got a really original set of old Grover tuners on there with the tulip heads, and I really love those. And it does have a volute, and it has a nice big chunky baseball bat style neck. This guitar is actually kind of heavy for what it is, especially not being a carved top Les Paul. It actually has some weight relief in terms of body contours and whatnot, but I don't know if it has any internal weight relief. The serial number on this guitar puts it made in February of 81. So that again jives with the date stamps on the pickups, because I've got an 80 and an 81, and it kind of makes sense that they would use some of the old stock as they went along. Now there's one other thing that can be learned from the Gibson serial numbers, especially back then. Of course, I know that this one was made on the 57th day of 81, but also because the third to last number starts with a 5, that tells me this was made in the Nashville factory. So the zeros at this period were made in Kalamazoo, and the 5s were made at Nashville. All right, is there anything else we can learn from this thing? Well, I can tell that this guitar has at least a 4-piece body. 1, 2, 3, 4. So the wings are kind of glued on, but there is a center joint that runs up the whole thing. The fretboard is interesting to me. You probably noticed it when I was sort of showing the guitar, but this thing is ebony, but it's got these brown kind of interesting streaks in it. And when I bought this guitar, I wasn't so sure about it, so I posted some photos on one of the forums on Facebook that I belong to. This is known as Macassar. I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce it, but it looks like Macassar ebony. And it's just meant to be kind of streaky kind of ebony. It looks cool to me. It actually almost looks like a flame going up the neck, but I'm sure they didn't pick that because of the Firebrand. What I've heard is that this was a period of time when ebony was hard to get, and a lot of guitar manufacturers were taking all the black ebony out of the market. They basically used it all up, and so Gibson and several other manufacturers started using these streaky forms of ebony so that they could still continue to use ebony, get that ebony sound, but just a different look. It looks cool. It's got dot inlays, which that's pretty 80s. Most of the Gibson stuff in the 80s, at least the studio lines and some of the other entry-level models, had dot inlays. It's got pretty standard bridge and tailpiece. I didn't see any markings underneath these that would indicate Germany. In the later 80s, I know that Gibson started using all German hardware, but given that this has Grovers on it, I think they were still using some of the American-made hardware at the bridge and tail. The switch is definitely a Switchcraft switch. It's got probably the original ring here because it's slightly faded, but the tip might not be original, but the knobs, these knobs are definitely original. They're nice and yellowed, which is kind of cool to me. Looks like to me that it's had a replacement strap button down here, but this one up top looks like an original Gibson. Now, if you look at like Kluson strap buttons, they've got a real pronounced trumpet shape on them, and this one just has sort of a hard angle to it. The jack, it looks like every other 80s guitar I've seen from Gibson. It's got that stainless surround, Switchcraft jack. Looks good to me. Well, I'm gonna flip this thing over, put the back plate back on it, and we'll go ahead and tune it up and just check neck relief and some other small things. All right, well, I've got the tuning back to normal. Put the capo on the 1st fret. We're gonna flip this guitar up a little bit, fret it at the 17th, and just give it a quick check at the 8th fret. It might have a touch too much neck relief. I'm gonna go ahead and take that truss rod cover off anyway because I do wanna check under there. My nightmare would be looking under here and seeing a truss rod nut that was nice and stripped, but let's just cross our fingers. No, actually, there's a truss rod nut that looks like it's never been touched. So this is the truss rod cover. It says Firebrand, the Paul Deluxe. So that's sort of the model. All right, let's see. Let me go ahead and get a nut driver. Okay, well, there's plenty of trash in there where the original nut was painted over, and I just need to get that out of the way so I can give this thing a decent tightening. Now, I don't know if this is the original gauge of strings. I don't even know what gauge of strings these are, but let's see how that did. All right, that's perfect. That's just where it needs to be. All right, well, my truss rod works. I can put this truss rod cover back on. All right, well, that's all working right. I have tested the electronics before and they are working. And I did want to just quickly show this headstock. So the only part about this guitar that makes me sad is that the headstock is chipped just slightly on both edges. Other than that, this guitar doesn't have very many battle scars at all. This nut looks like the original nut. It's definitely got some yellowed lacquer on the back and on both sides, and it does not look like it's ever been off this guitar. It's a nice solid nut. The string slots look good. They're angled correctly. I don't have to change anything there. You can see the gold Gibson logo that they put on these things. There is no top laminate on these. They just painted the headstocks black and put the gold logo on. Everything otherwise looks pretty good. All right, well, hopefully that was a little bit of a history lesson on the Paul, and this is a weird model, like I said, made in the late 70s, early 80s. Wasn't a huge success. Gibson ended up clearancing these things out at the end of their run. They're kind of a weird piece of Gibson history, but you know, I'm into the 80s stuff, and I really like the Tim Shaw pickups. I don't know, just something weird. So thanks for hanging out with me on this episode. I really appreciate when you guys like and comment on my videos. Please check out my Amazon links. Go ahead and subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you guys next time.